Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, lots of horror and plenty of cryptids. It's my November wrap-up. So November ended up being a very good reading month for me. Read a ton of books and several very, very good books as well. So we'll talk about all of those with you today. In terms of kind of general facts about November, so obviously I started my Read What You Own challenge in November. So I started that on the 6th of November. I am up to 24 books. So I've read 24 books for that. So that's going well so far. I'm still hoping to finish by the end of January. I did end up in November reading some longer books. One in particular was like really long. So I'm hoping to get some shorter books under my belt in December and really get ahead on the challenge so that I can wrap it up in January. But we shall see. The best laid plans of mice and men and all that. So 25 books read in total in November. And 5 volumes of manga as well. So yeah, a decent amount read. So very pleased with that. And took part in 2 really enjoyable readathons in November as well. So the first was Novelisation November, which was a patron-only readathon run by Andrew from It Came From The Page for his patrons. So focusing on like movie novelisations and kind of movie-related books, which I really, really enjoyed. So several books I'll talk about were part of that. And then also the Cryptid Readathon, which was run by Jason from Jason's Weird Reads, Sin from Sin's Book Nook, and Crystal from Fibre Artsy, which was, as the name suggests, a readathon focused around cryptids. So I read a few books for that and really enjoyed that as well. Plus, did some buddy reads and group reads and all sorts of good stuff. So let me crack on and talk about the books. What I'm going to do, as I've started doing for these monthly wrap-ups, is I'll talk about the books in the order I read them, and then at the end I will tell you my favourite book of the month. Right, so let's start then. So the first thing I read then was The Woman in Me by Britney Spears, which I actually listened to the audiobook of, which was very well narrated by Michelle Williams. I thought she did an excellent job of the narration. And this was good. It was better than I expected it to be. It was, a very interesting, Britney Spears' account of what's happened to her, during her life, during her career. Some terrible stuff she suffered at the hands of her family, particularly when she was younger, but also, clearly more recently with their conservatorship. It was an interesting read. As I said in one of my weekly wrap-ups where I talked about it, I felt like it could have given a little bit more. I felt like she could have broadened things out a little bit and talked more about the general experience of women and young people in the entertainment industry. But overall, I thought it was a very decent memoir, and I did enjoy it. After that, something completely different. So I read Wolves of the Calla by Stephen King, book 5. Is it book 5? Yeah, book 5 in the Dark Tower series. So a big, chunky book. This one was one of the ones I read. I think this was pretty much the last novel I read before starting the Read What You Own challenge. So this was good but too long, and it goes on a massive digression in the middle where you get a whole load of backstory about a character, and which was kind of interesting because it's a character who's appeared in a previous Stephen King book, so you kind of get his story between being in that book, Salem's Lot, and this book. But I felt like it slowed the book down too much. The book starts with the setup for something that sounds like it's going to be really, really exciting, and then you get a massive digression for 300 pages, and then it wraps up with that exciting bit at the end, which was indeed exciting, but it felt like it took a long time to get there. So we'll continue with the Dark Tower series. Only a few more books to read in that now, but yeah, this one was good, but maybe not quite as good as it could have been. I then read, and I've reviewed these on the channel, so I read 4 volumes of Blood on the Tracks. In fact, I read another 2 volumes after, or 3 volumes, I think, actually, after these as well. But these ones I've got physical copies of. So, Blood on the Tracks, very, very good, very disturbing manga series about a teenage boy and his relationship with his mum, who's got severe mental health issues. Really, really interesting, fantastically well illustrated. One of the best kind of like combinations, I suppose, of like visual art and storytelling I've seen for a while. I really thought that the art in this really helped convey emotion and things like that in the story in a really intelligent and effective way. So I really recommend this series, and have done, as I said, a full review of it on the channel. Right, so now we are at the point where I'm starting the Read What You Own challenge in the month. So got a couple of short things under my belt to begin with. Both of these were for Novelisation November. They both kind of got some sort of relationship to movie novelisations. And both were rereads actually for me. So the first was The Outsiders by SE Hinton, the classic kind of YA novel of juvenile delinquents and things like that. I've read this. I should have read this when I was a teenager, and for some reason I didn't. I read it a few years ago and really, really enjoyed it. On the reread, I didn't enjoy it quite as much, but I still thought it was really effective. It's moving, it's gripping, the characters are very memorable. Read for Novelisation November because it's got this cheesy kind of movie tie-in cover. So that was very good. Then also read for Novelisation November Shaun Hutson's Relics. So this is this counted for Novelisation November because Shaun Hutson also wrote movie novelisations. In particular, the novelisation for The Terminator in the UK, at least. The US novelisation was done by someone else. He's a very cheesy British horror author, primarily active during the 80s, although he's still publishing stuff now. I've long been a big fan of Shaun Hutson. I just find his books very, very entertaining. This one, no exception. Extremely graphic, extremely over the top and silly, but I really, really enjoyed it. Next up, a couple of things I read for the Cryptid Readathon. So Bigfoot Crank Stomp by Erik Williams. So this is a book about Bigfoot on meth. So set in the, kind of out in the woods. There's like a meth lab. They've captured a Bigfoot. They're feeding it meth. See if you can guess what happens next. So it was entertaining, but I felt like it dwelt a bit too much on some fairly unpleasant sex scenes. And would have done better to focus on Bigfoot smashing stuff up. So reasonably entertaining, but not quite as good as I'd hoped. And then read The Haunted Forest Tour by James A. Moore, and I'm blanking on the name of the other guy, Jeff Strand. So this was fun. This is like a mix of Jurassic Park and Cabin in the Woods or something like that. So there's this haunted forest that just sprung up out of nowhere. It's filled with like mythical creatures and cryptids and things like that. And somebody decides to set up a bus tour going through. So in terms of like bad ideas that are good setups for novels, I think these two, bus tour through a haunted forest and giving Bigfoot meth, probably on a par with each other, aren't they? So this again was, it was fine. I preferred it to Bigfoot Crank Stomp. It wasn't amazing. Some people really, really loved this book, and I didn't love it, but I did think it was fun. Lots of action, lots of kind of peril and stuff like that. So it was entertaining. Then another reread for me. So I read Down with Skool by Geoffrey Willans. So this is a comic children's novel from the 50s, written from the perspective of this schoolboy Molesworth. So the first in a series of books, I think there's about 5 of them, about this schoolboy Molesworth. They're just very funny. I loved them when I was a kid. I really enjoyed reading it again. So he's got a lovely, so Geoffrey Willans has got a lovely comic style. There's excellent illustrations as well from Ronald Searle, which really help bring the book to life. But just Molesworth's style of writing, like the constant misspellings and things like that, are very, very entertaining. So really, really enjoyed that. Then read, again for Novelisation November, so this is a movie tie-in novel, so not a direct novelisation, but a book set in a movie universe. So Alien: The Cold Forge by Alex White. This was phenomenally good. So I've done a review of this on the channel. I really thought this was an excellent, excellent book. Really gripping. So the setup is there's a space station where people from Weyland-Yutani, the evil corporation from the Alien movies, are doing experiments, like weapons experiments on xenomorphs. again, like the previous two books, or the other two books I talked about, clearly you can tell where this is going to go, and it does go in that direction. So there's this character called Dorian, who's is he called Dorian? Yeah, Dorian, who's like an auditor who's been sent to try and find things that are wrong on this space station and reduce costs. Who's the most despicable character I've read for ages. Really horrific character, but all of the characters in this book were interesting, and there's some really gripping situations. There's some interesting reflections on various things as well. So there's a bit of depth to it, but mostly it's just a really, really gripping, exciting sci-fi horror novel. So I had a great time with that. Next then, something else for the Cryptid Readathon, The Mermaid of Sicily by Jincey Lumpkin. So the second in her series of books about this killer mermaid called Gia. They're really fun, these books. They're a bit spicy, they're a bit silly, they're very kind of trashy in a good kind of Jackie Collins almost kind of a way, but just really, really entertaining. So I had a very good time with this. It's like a direct sequel to the first book in the series, follows an investigation into the death of one of Gia's previous boyfriends as she starts a relationship with someone else. So there's just loads going on in it, and it was very, very entertaining. Then read as a buddy read with one of my patrons, the French classic The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston LeRoux, which was a lot more fun and a lot more kind of pulpy and trashy than I expected it to be. So clearly very melodramatic and over the top in terms of the overall story, which will probably be familiar to most people, but had some great sequences. Like there's this whole section towards the end which was very silly but really enjoyable, where they go kind of underneath the opera house into the tunnels and things like that. So I had a really good time with it. I thought it was a very entertaining book, and a lot more fun than I expected it to be. Right, up next then, again for Novelisation November, I read Godzilla and Godzilla Reigns Again by Shigeru Kayama, translated by Geoffrey Angles. So these were two kind of young person's novelisations of the first two Godzilla movies, originally published in Japan in the 50s, and only this year translated into English. So they're kind of what you'd expect, in that they are fast-paced, slightly over the top and silly novels about Godzilla going around smashing stuff up. But there is an interesting depth there. So the character of Godzilla and that kind of setup of nuclear testing and things like that causing this monster to appear in the wake, written, the movies originally produced, not long after the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So really interesting from that respect. Really fun, just really fun books to read as well. And also there's an excellent afterword by the translator where he talks about the origins of the movies and the books and things like that. So if you're at all into Godzilla, I definitely recommend this. And isn't that a lovely cover as well? It's a beautifully presented book. Right, moving on then, another memoir. Started the month with Britney Spears. Halfway through the month, again, I listened to the audiobook of this. This was Pageboy by Elliot Page. So Elliot Page's account of being a young actor in Hollywood, what that's like, some of the kind of abuse he suffered as he went through that journey. Oops, excuse me, just dropped my post-it. Some of the abuse he suffered as he went through that journey, particularly as a young person. Talks about coming out as gay and coming out as trans. So really, really interesting. The book skips about a bit in places in terms of the timeline, so it doesn't follow a linear timeline in the same way that the Britney Spears book does. So it can be a little bit difficult to kind of keep track of exactly where you are because of that, and it did feel a little bit repetitive at times as well. So he does go over and over the same points at times, but generally speaking, I thought it was a very interesting, heartfelt book. Definitely illuminating for me as a cis person to read a bit more about the emotions and feelings of being trans. So that was very interesting, and some interesting insight into the movie industry as well. So overall, I thought it was a decent book. After that, I read for MJ from Reading the Sci for her Patreon book club. I read Silver Nitrate by Sylvia Moreno-Garcia, which is a book I've been meaning to get to for ages, well, since it came out earlier this year. So a really interesting and fun horror novel set around the idea of like cursed movies, which is something I love the concept of, just generally. So in this one, there's this movie which is supposed to have kind of magic built into it. So originally made in the kind of silent era, kind of as a spell by this guy who was an occultist. And it's about these two friends, a woman who's like a sound editor in the movies and a guy who's an actor, who are investigating, the creation of this movie and what happened to it subsequently after a friend of theirs who has some connection to it dies mysteriously. So just a really interesting concept. The two central characters I thought were absolutely fantastic. Really enjoyed their kind of friendship. I didn't feel like it leaned quite as hard into the horror side of things as I might have liked it to. But overall, I really, really enjoyed it. And then after that, so that again was for the novelisation November as a book kind of set around the movies. And then after that, for the Cryptid Readathon, I read Ferocity by Stephen Laws. So one of the prompts for the Cryptid Readathon was to read about a cryptid that's near you, if that makes sense, like geographically near you. So this is a book about British big cat. So if you don't know, there's this, kind of theory that there are big ferocious cats roaming around some of the moors and things like that in the UK. So this kind of focused on that, but also had a really strong kind of crime story running through it as well. So it ends up like the second half of it basically is like a hostage situation, which is really tense. But there's also big cats roaming around outside and a terrible storm. So it just threw everything together and made for a really, really gripping and tense read. Stephen Laws is an author you don't hear people talk about that much. So he was kind of big in the, I think, late 80s, early 90s was kind of when he had his heyday. And published a load of good books back then. But yeah, I've always really enjoyed his stuff. He deserves a bit more attention, I think. After that, I read volume 7 of Monster by Naoki Urasawa. So this manga series, which I'm nearly finished now, I've got 2 more volumes to go. I think this is a great series. I really enjoy it. I think the artwork's fantastic. The story, which is about these mysterious twins and kind of like Eastern European spies, and there's all sorts going on. It's got a real nice kind of 70s thriller vibe to it, and this hero doctor who's just a fantastic kind of classic hero that you might get in like a Hitchcock movie or something like that. He's a really interesting central character. So yeah, still really enjoying this. And as I've said before, the thing that Urasawa does brilliantly in this is introduce kind of fairly incidental characters and make them really fully rounded and interesting. So it's a really interesting exercise in storytelling, I think, and I'm thoroughly enjoying the series. After that, I read a nice short pulpy novel which I enjoyed greatly, The Polar Treasure by Kenneth Robeson, which is book 4 in the Doc Savage series. So originally came out, I think, in the 30s. So a very pulpy adventure story where Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze, who's this kind of Superman type character who can do anything he turns his hand to. He and his crew go to the polar regions to track down some treasure. Very silly, but very enjoyable. I had a really good time with it. After that, another volume of manga. Actually, I missed this one. For when I said I'd done 5 volumes of manga at the start, I should have said 6 and 24 books. So yeah, apologies. So this is Associate Professor Akira Takasuki's Conjecture, Volume 1. Who's it by? It's by Toji Ayo did the art, and the original story is by Mikaji Sawamura. So I think this was originally a series of light novels and has then been translated into, or turned into a manga series. Light novels, if you don't know, are kind of short, enjoyable, pulpy, kind of novels published in Japan typically. So this was really fun. So it's kind of an occult detective type thing where there's this professor of folklore at a university who gets a student, like one of his students, who has the ability of being able to tell whenever anyone is telling a lie. So he involves him and they become like a duo investigating kind of reports of folklore and weird goings on and things like that in the local area. So just fun basically. I enjoyed that. Next up, again for novelisation November, a Star Wars novel, so set in the Star Wars universe. The first book set in the Star Wars universe that wasn't Star Wars. So the first book set in the Star Wars universe was the novelisation of the movie Star Wars. This came out shortly afterwards in the wake of that success. So Splinter of the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster. clearly written before, you know, all of the ideas in Empire Strikes Back were fully fleshed out. There's a lot of scenes in here of Luke and Leia kind of being uncomfortably close to each other, and Luke feeling a bit flustered, which was slightly weird to read with the benefit of hindsight. But again, a fun pulpy adventure. I read a review of it that said it was basically like like Luke and Leia in a D&D module. So basically, they crash land on a planet. They have to get this jewel for someone who can then get them off the planet. So it's a lot of kind of quest stuff, very episodic, but really entertaining. I enjoyed this a lot more than I expected to. I wasn't too sure about it at first, but once I got into it, it was just a fun, colourful kind of science fantasy adventure type ride. And as I've said before, it's nice to see something that is Star Wars, but not at all pompous. I felt like the Star Wars prequels ended up being a bit pompous and got away from the that kind of just sense of pure fun and enjoyment that's so much a part of the original Star Wars trilogy. So I enjoyed that a lot. Next up, a bit of non-fiction. So How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division by Elif Shafak. A very short book, an interesting book, but not a desperately original book would be my assessment. So she talks about the impact of social media on our lives, the fact that society seems to be more and more kind of argumentative, for want of a better word, the fact that there are more and more divisions between different groups in society and that kind of thing, and so many politicians kind of capitalise on those divisions to try and create greater divisions and get power. So an interesting book, but I didn't feel like there was anything that I hadn't read before in it. So, well written, interestingly, kind of framed and things like that. But arguments I agree with, but that I've seen before. After that, I read Rouge by Mona Awad. So the first Mona Awad book I've read. I thought this was a bit much, if I'm honest. It was really confusing. It's interesting, and I know a lot of people really rate this book. A lot of people I've seen talk about it really, really enjoyed it. So it's about a young woman who has a difficult relationship with her mum. Her mum's died, and she's kind of trying to, sort out her estate and things like that. There's a lot in here about kind of like body image and the beauty industry and things like that, particularly for people who aren't white. So that was kind of interesting, but there's just so much weirdness in this book. There's so much kind of fancy magical realism type stuff, and I just found it all a bit too much. I got very confused by it. There were some sections of it I thought were really, really good, but overall it was a bit of a dud for me, I'm afraid. But as I say, lots of people do enjoy it, so maybe check some other reviews of it before making a final judgment. I then read another reread for me, so a book I first read as a kid. Really enjoyed the reread. So this is The Wave by Morton Rue, which is a book about a novel based on true events. So in the late 60s in California, this history teacher, in order to try and teach his students about like the rise of Nazism in Germany, and how that had managed to happen despite German society typically, most of the people in German society not being Nazis and being, reasonable people, how Nazism had managed to take control so quickly. So he sets up kind of this social experiment, which goes horribly wrong in that it spreads like wildfire throughout the school. It's kind of too successful, really. So really interesting. Definitely kind of a YA book, so a bit light on kind of original characters and things like that. But an interesting read. Really enjoyed revisiting it. So yeah, I first read this probably 40 years ago. But yeah, had a good time reading that again. Then read an Edge book. So in my continuing voyage through the Edge series, so this is book 20, Sullivan's Law by George G. Gilman. So a kind of brutal but fun Western from the 70s. So George G. Gilman was an English guy who I think apparently like never read any Westerns when he started writing the Edge movies, the Edge books. I think he'd maybe seen a few Western movies, but didn't really know anything about it at all. But just has fun with some of the tropes and concepts and things like that. So I'm really enjoying reading this series. They're definitely kind of cheap and nasty, but in an entertaining way. Right, up next then, another thing for the Cryptid Readathon, another kind of 80s British horror novel, Curse of Loch Ness, by Peter Tremaine. So this was a weird book. So it's about a woman who's, I think, her kind of much older cousin, who's very wealthy, has died. She didn't really know him at all. He lived in Scotland and had like a mansion up there. She gets called to go up there and kind of sort things out in the mansion and decide what she wants to do with it. And discovers his diaries and things which talk about all sorts of weird stuff. So there's this kind of gothic vibe to the first half of the story, but you know it's set near Loch Ness, and every so often you get an interlude told from the perspective of the Loch Ness Monster. So you know the Loch Ness Monster is going to come into it at some point. I won't spoil the second half of it, but it becomes very, very weird and slightly uncomfortable. It just went to places I did not expect at all. But which were quite fun because they were so ridiculous and outrageous. So I had fun with that one. Then read this throughout the month, a short story collection. So this was the group read for my patrons this month. The book is Nocturnes by John Connolly, which was fantastic. One of the best, certainly the best like single author horror short story collection I've read recently. I really thought it was great. So John Connolly, best known for writing the Charlie Parker series of mysteries, and there is in fact a Charlie Parker novella in this which was excellent, but a load of other short stories as well. It's a really like a decent sized volume. I think it was about 500 pages, so you get a load of stories in there, 2 novellas, the Charlie Parker one and another one, and they're all slightly different from each other. They're all really interesting. There's a couple of nicely humorous ones. I just thought it was a really, really excellent, really excellent collection. There's one clown story in there which was truly creepy and chilling. Which is, if you like killer clown stories, do check out this collection because the clown story in it was excellent. Just generally speaking, I thought it was a truly, a very, very good short story collection if you like horror. And there's another one as well. Connolly, I think more recently, has published another short story collection. So I definitely need to read that, and definitely need to get into the Charlie Parker books again, which I've read, I think, the first couple of. After that then, so we're nearly at the end of the month now, so 2 books to go. So I read Those Who Walk Away by Patricia Highsmith. So this is my ongoing read-through of all of Patricia Highsmith's fiction, which I'm doing with Anne from the channel Anne Novella. So this was good. This was the first Highsmith book I ever read. So I first read this a few years ago. It's got a very, very Patricia Highsmith setup. So if you know Patricia Highsmith at all, her books are often focused around 2 characters, so 2 central characters who've got some sort of animosity between each other, and they're often about Americans outside America as well. So this one has these 2 guys who are in Europe, in kind of Spain and Italy, I think. And one of them, so there's a woman who connects them who's died by suicide. So one of them is her husband and the other one is her father, and the father blames the husband for her death. And they have kind of this ongoing battle throughout the book as a result of that. But just the way Highsmith does the kind of psychology of characters like this is always really, really interesting. And they make decisions which objectively seem like really, really strange decisions, but actually when you get into their minds, kind of makes sense. So a really interesting, gripping and enjoyable thriller from Highsmith. She's pretty much always dependable. I'm really enjoying reading through the books by hers, and even reading, like one a month. And even though there are, very much consistent themes and settings and things like that in her books, I'm not getting tired of them yet. So very much enjoyed that. And then finally, the biggest book I read this month, a huge book and a very challenging book as well, I have to say, Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This copy was very kindly sent to me a while ago by Michelle from the channel Michelle's Melancholia, a channel which is sadly is not producing content at the moment, but hopefully Michelle will come back and start uploading again soon. This was really, really excellent. So this is set in Argentina in kind of the 70s, 80s and into the 90s. So set very much against that backdrop of, kind of terrible oppression and dictatorship in Argentina. but is a a horror novel at heart about this weird kind of secret society, and particularly about this young guy and his dad. And his dad is kind of heavily involved in this society, and they look to the child to be like their kind of saviour character. So some really weird and horrible stuff that happens in this book. Very graphic at times, very disturbing at times, and that kind of political edge that it has throughout is really, really effective as well. But boy, is it a big book. It's like 700 pages, but it didn't, and despite the fact that it's A, so long, and B, like quite heavy in terms of the subject matter, it was a book that so gripped and kind of pulled me into its world that it didn't feel like a struggle to read at all. I was just completely immersed in what was going on, in the characters and in the situations and things like that. So a truly excellent novel. Really, really enjoyed it. And that, in case you hadn't guessed, because there are a few books that I really enjoyed this month, I think this is my book of the month. I really thought this was an excellent novel. Right, so that is November done. I hope you all had good reading months in November as well. Let me know in the comments what you've been reading. Let me know if you've read any of the books I talked about. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.